In the spring of 1922, a wedding took place at St. Margaret's, Westminster, that drew a crowd large enough to block the surrounding streets. The bride was 20 years old. She wore a gown that had taken months to make. Outside, people pressed against the iron railings to catch a glimpse of her. Not because they knew her, but because of what she represented: youth, money, a title, and the particular kind of beauty that photographs well in newsprint. Inside, the ceremony proceeded exactly as planned. What the photographs do not show is the conversation that had taken place in the weeks before, a quiet, practical understanding between two people who liked each other, admired each other, and had already in their own ways decided that the marriage would need to accommodate certain arrangements. Neither of them announced this, neither needed to. It was understood. Edwina Ashley was, by the time of that wedding, one of the wealthiest women in Britain. She had been so for less than 2 years. The fortune had arrived suddenly when she was 19, through the death of her grandfather, and it had changed the shape of every room she entered. Her sister Mary stood nearby that day in the position that younger sisters occupy at weddings, present, dressed carefully, and slightly outside the story being told. The two of them had grown up together inside a world of extraordinary material comfort and notable emotional scarcity. What that combination produces in a person, and what it costs over a lifetime, is what this story is about. Ernest Cassell arrived in England from Cologne in 1869 with very little. By the time he died in 1921, he had accumulated a fortune estimated at over £6 million, the equivalent in today's terms of several hundred million. Through a combination of financial acuity, discretion, and a remarkable ability to make himself useful to powerful men, he financed railways in South America, reorganized the Egyptian national debt, and became, over several decades, the closest financial confidant of Edward VII. He was also Jewish, self-made, and foreign-born, which meant that no matter how large the fortune grew, certain doors remained closed to him in ways that were never stated directly, but were always understood. He compensated through architecture. His London home, Grosvenor Square, was filled with rare furniture, old masters, and the kind of deliberate grandeur that announces itself the moment a guest steps through the door. He also kept a country estate, Moulton Paddocks, and later Brook House on Park Lane, which he had rebuilt at enormous expense into something that contemporaries described as palatial, and that others, more quietly, found slightly airless. The rooms were large, the staff was extensive, the flowers were always fresh. Into this world, Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley was born in November 1900, and her sister Mary Maud 4 years later. Their father, Wilfred Ashley, was a Conservative MP and later a peer, a man of moderate means and conventional habits who had married Cassell's daughter Maud in 1901. Maud died in 1911 when Edwina was 10 and Mary 6 from complications that her death certificate described in clinical terms and that her family never discussed in any other. Their father remarried within a few years. The second wife, Muriel Forbes Sempill, was not fond of the children, and the children understood this clearly. What followed for Edwina and Mary was an education in surfaces. They were sent to the correct schools, dressed in the correct clothes, taught to move through rooms without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves, except when attention was required, at which point they were expected to receive it gracefully. Cassell, their grandfather, was the fixed point of their early lives. He visited, he wrote letters, he paid for things. He was not a warm man. Contemporaries describe him as formal, precise, and somewhat difficult to read. But he was consistent, which is not nothing when everything else in a household is subject to the preferences of a stepmother. Edwina spent considerable time at Brook House during school holidays. She learned by observation what money looks like when it is very old in Europe and very new in England at the same time. The particular combination of confidence and anxiety that runs through households where the fortune is secure but the social position is still being established. Cassell entertained politicians, bankers, and royalty. The Prince of Wales visited. Agreements were made over dinner that shaped policy the following morning. Edwina sat at the edge of these rooms and watched. She was, by all accounts, quick, not in the brittle, performative way of children raised to impress adults, but observant in a way that occasionally made people around her uncomfortable. She noticed things. She remembered them. A family friend who visited Brooke House in 1913 wrote in his diary that evening that young Edwina had asked him a question about a financial transaction he had discussed with her grandfather, and that her question had been better than most he received from men in his professional life. He meant it as a compliment. He also moved on to the next subject fairly quickly. Mary, 4 years younger, occupied a different position in the household. She was quieter, less immediately striking, and in the particular arithmetic of wealthy families with 2 daughters and one anticipated inheritance, she was the secondary figure. This was not cruelty. No one sat her down and explained it. It was simply the accumulated weight of small signals. Which child was asked to accompany Cassell to formal dinners? Which was mentioned first in letters? Which was photographed more often? And whose opinions were solicited at the table? Edwina was the one who would inherit. Mary was the one who would need to marry well. In 1914, when Edwina was 13, the war arrived and rearranged everything. Brooke House was converted in part into a military hospital. Cassell, whose German origins had never been entirely forgiven by a certain segment of English society, now found them weaponized. The press ran stories. His name appeared in lists of enemy sympathizers. He was never formally charged with anything, because there was nothing to charge him with, but the experience left a mark that his fortune could not fully absorb. He withdrew further into privacy and continued to accumulate money with what his biographers describe as renewed intensity, as though the next million might finally settle the question of his belonging. Edwina watched this too. She was at an age when children are beginning to understand that the world outside the house has opinions about the house, and that those opinions are not always manageable. Her grandfather's position, wealthy, well-connected, and still not quite accepted, was an early lesson in the limits of what money actually buys in a society that has decided for its own reasons who counts and who does not. By the time Edwina was sent to finishing school in 1918, she had been shaped by a household in which emotional life was largely private, financial life was deliberately visible, and the two were never discussed in relation to each other. Her mother was dead, her father was distant and remarried, her grandfather was retreating. The fortune that would eventually come to her was already in some ways the most consistent presence in her life. Not as money exactly, but as the thing that determined how people looked at her and what they expected. Mary, at 14, was still at school. Her own path, quieter, less documented, and in its own way more constrained, was already being determined by the same forces, though they would press on her differently. The elder sister who would inherit everything, and the younger sister who would receive considerably less were both moving toward the same world of arranged introductions, strategic marriages, and carefully managed appearances. Neither of them had been asked whether this was what they wanted. The question would not have occurred to anyone to ask. Ernest Cassell died on the morning of September 21st, 1921, at Brooke House. He had been ill for some time, though the nature of his illness was kept, in the manner of his household, largely private. He was 70 years old. His estate was valued at approximately £6 million, a figure that appeared in the newspapers the following day with the kind of precision that suggests it had been anticipated for some time by people with reasons to follow such things. The will was not complicated. The bulk of the estate went to Edwina. Mary received a smaller settlement. Various staff members and charitable institutions received bequests that Cassell had arranged with the same methodical attention he gave to everything involving money. The lawyers had been prepared. The transfers were orderly. Within a few weeks, Edwina Ashley, 20 years old and still living in her father's house, became one of the wealthiest women in Britain. The newspapers said so explicitly. That was perhaps the first thing she learned about inheriting money at that scale, that it is a public event. The fortune did not arrive quietly, as a private matter between a grandfather and his grandchild. It arrived as a news story with her name in the headline and a number attached to it, and from that morning onward the number followed her into every room she entered. People who had met her before now met her differently. Invitations arrived from households that had not previously issued them. Men who had shown polite interest showed something more concentrated. Her father, Wilfred Ashley, did not discuss the inheritance with her directly, but he began, around this time, to take a more active interest in her social calendar. She also inherited the houses, Brooke House, with its staff of dozens, its French furniture, its portrait gallery, and its running costs that would have supported several ordinary families for a year. Moulton paddocks, other properties. The physical weight of the fortune was considerable, not just in monetary terms, but in the simple logistical fact of having to decide what to do with rooms that had been arranged according to someone else's taste and maintained by people whose livelihoods now depended on her decisions. She was 20 years old. She had not been trained for this, precisely. She had been trained to occupy wealthy rooms, which is a related but different skill. What she did in the months immediately following Cassell's death was move quickly. She redecorated, she traveled, she accepted invitations to houses in the country and parties in the city, and she moved through them with the ease of someone who had been watching how to do this since childhood. If there was grief for her grandfather, and there almost certainly was in some form given that he had been the most stable presence in her early life, it did not slow her down visibly. The pace she set in the autumn of 1921 was the pace she would largely maintain for the rest of her life, though no one, including her, would have described it in those terms at the time. It was at a party in October 1921 that she met Lord Louis Mountbatten. He was 21, a naval officer, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, and possessed of exactly the kind of confident charm that photographs well and reads well in society columns. He was also, by the standards of his family and title, not particularly wealthy. The Battenbergs, the family had anglicized the name during the war, had rank and connection, but not the resources to support the style of life that rank and connection were expected to require. Louis understood this clearly. He was not cynical about it exactly, but he was realistic. Their courtship proceeded rapidly. By December, they were engaged. The announcement produced the expected volume of coverage, and the coverage had a particular flavor. The young heiress and the Royal Naval officer, the fortune meeting the title, that neither of them could have been entirely surprised by. Letters from this period, which Edwina kept, and which her daughter Pamela later published, suggest that the two of them were genuinely fond of each other. Louis wrote with energy and humor. Edwina's replies were more measured but warm. There is affection in the correspondence. There is also, if one reads carefully, a kind of mutual assessment. Two people who understood what the arrangement offered each of them and had decided, honestly, that it was enough. What it offered Edwina was a title and a social position that even Cassell's millions had not fully secured. Her grandfather had been wealthy and well-connected, but he had also been Jewish and foreign-born, and the particular ceiling those facts created had been visible to her from childhood. Marrying Louis Mountbatten did not simply add a name. It moved her into a different social register entirely, one where the question of belonging was, at least formally, settled. What it offered Louis was the financial freedom to live as his position required. This was not a secret. His family was aware of it. His friends were aware of it. Louis himself in later years would not have denied it. The money allowed him to pursue a naval career without the constant anxiety about costs that constrained other officers of similar rank but smaller means. It paid for the entertaining, the travel, the maintenance of houses, and the general style of life that his ambitions, which were considerable, required. Mary was present at the engagement announcement, as she was present at most family occasions during this period. She was 17. Her own future was the subject of conversations in the household that she was not always included in, but that concerned her directly. The pattern was already in place. Her sister's choices, her sister's fortune, and her sister's social position would continue to define the frame within which Mary's own life was arranged. A smaller inheritance meant a smaller pool of acceptable matches, acceptable by the standards of the world they had both been raised in. And a smaller pool meant less room to maneuver. The wedding was set for July 1922. Brooke House began preparing. The guest list ran to several hundred names. The flowers alone required a separate organizational effort. Cassell had been dead less than a year, and already the fortune he had spent a lifetime accumulating was being deployed in the service of a spectacle he had not planned and would not have entirely recognized. The marriage of Edwina Ashley and Lord Louis Mountbatten took place on July 18, 1922, at St. Margaret's, Westminster, the church adjacent to the Houses of Parliament that had by long custom become the preferred venue for weddings that wished to be seen without quite becoming a state occasion. The distinction was technical. In practice, the event had the scale and organization of something considerably more official. The Prince of Wales attended. So did the King and Queen of Romania, several members of the extended British royal family, most of the Conservative cabinet, and a guest list that the newspapers spent considerable space cataloging. Outside, the crowd was large enough that police had been stationed at intervals along the street. The photographs taken that morning show a bride in a gown of silver and white, a groom in naval uniform, and a church interior arranged with the kind of precision that requires weeks of advance work and a staff experienced enough to make it look effortless. The coverage was immediate and extensive. The Times devoted 3 columns to it. Illustrated papers ran photographs. Society magazines prepared features. The wedding became, within days of its occurrence, a fixed point in the public imagination of that particular season, the event that other events were dated in relation to. People who had not attended referred to it with the familiarity of those who had. What none of the coverage mentioned, because none of it was known publicly, was that the couple had already arrived at an understanding about the nature of their marriage. The specifics of that understanding were not written down, not in any document that has survived at any rate, but its outlines became visible quickly enough. Louis had, before the wedding, formed an attachment to another woman. Edwina was aware of this. The attachment did not end with the engagement. There is no evidence that either of them expected it to. This was not, in the world they inhabited, entirely unusual. Marriages in their social circle frequently operated as formal arrangements within which individuals maintained private lives that were understood but not acknowledged. The rules were specific. Discretion was required, appearances were to be maintained, and the arrangement functioned as long as everyone observed the boundaries. What was slightly unusual about the Mountbatten marriage was how early the accommodation was reached and how explicitly, by the standards of their time and class. It seems to have been acknowledged between them. A letter from Louis to Edwina, written during their engagement, survives in the collection that their daughter Pamela edited and published. It is affectionate, direct, and contains a passage that, read carefully, suggests he is explaining something about himself that he expects her to accept. Edwina's reply does not survive or has not been made available. What is known is that she married him 6 weeks after that letter was written. The honeymoon was conducted at a pace that left little room for the stillness that honeymoons are conventionally supposed to provide. They traveled to Glamis Castle, then to the continent, then to the United States, where Louis had naval duties and Edwina had a great deal of money to spend, and no particular reason not to spend it. New York received them with the enthusiasm it reserved for young, attractive, wealthy visitors with royal connections. There were dinners, parties, and social appearances. There were press photographs at the dock. Edwina bought things, clothes, art, objects, at a rate that briefly alarmed even people accustomed to significant expenditure. In London, Brooke House had been prepared for them. The staff had been retained, the rooms maintained, the household organized to receive its new mistress. Edwina walked through the rooms her grandfather had arranged with extraordinary care and began, almost immediately, to change them. The furniture was moved. Certain pieces were replaced. The overall effect she was working toward was something lighter, less Victorian, more in keeping with the aesthetic of the early 1920s, which was itself a deliberate departure from the preceding generation's taste for weight and permanence. This was not merely decoration. It was, in a practical sense, the first large decision she made as the person in charge of a very large household, and it was a decision about erasure, about whose taste would be visible in these rooms and whose would not. Cassell's Brooke House was meticulous and deliberate. Edwina's Brooke House was faster, brighter, and oriented toward a social life that ran on different rhythms. The transformation took months. It cost a considerable amount. Mary, by this point, had been established in a smaller household and was navigating the social world with the reduced leverage that a smaller inheritance provided. She was 18. The introductions being made on her behalf were appropriate to her financial position, which is to say, they were comfortable but not spectacular. The men her family considered suitable for her were of a different order than the man her sister had married, and this was understood by everyone involved without being stated by anyone. She attended her sister's events when invited. She appeared in the background of photographs. She learned, as younger siblings in wealthy families often do, to occupy the available space without drawing attention to the fact that it was not the space she might have chosen. Back at Brook House, the social season moved through its established rhythms. Edwina hosted dinners and was photographed at charity events, and appeared at the races and was written about in the papers with the particular mixture of admiration and surveillance that attached itself to wealthy young women who were also, by virtue of marriage and connection, adjacent to royalty. Louis was frequently away on naval postings. When he was home, the household operated at full capacity: staff, guests, entertainments. When he was not, it operated at a slightly different pace that was still, by any ordinary standard, relentless. What the first year of marriage produced beneath the photographs and the coverage and the social appearances was a domestic arrangement in which two people who liked each other and understood each other had settled into a structure that worked on its own terms. It was not the structure that the wedding guests had imagined when they watched from the pews of St. Margaret's. It was functional, in the way that arrangements made between intelligent adults who have realistic expectations of each other tend to be functional. It was also, in ways that would take years to become fully visible, lonely in a manner that no amount of company could entirely address. In the autumn of 1921, before the wedding, Louis Mountbatten had been posted to the HMS Renown as aide-de-camp to the Prince of Wales for a tour of India and Japan. He returned with photographs, stories, and a particular appetite for the kind of travel that placed you at the center of ceremonies designed for people of rank. The experience had confirmed something he already suspected about himself: that he was most comfortable when the situation around him was large enough to match his sense of his own importance. He was not arrogant in the conventional sense. He was simply a man who required a considerable stage. After the wedding, the stage expanded considerably. Edwina's fortune made possible a style of travel that even his royal connections could not have funded independently. In 1922 and 1923, the Mountbattens moved through the world with a freedom that had, at that point in history, very few parallels outside of actual monarchs. They traveled to the United States, where they were received by film studios and socialites, and had their photographs taken with people whose names filled newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. They went to Europe. They went further. In early 1924, they departed for a journey through parts of the British Empire that took them through several months and several continents. The logistics of such a trip required advanced planning, local hosts, and a staff capable of moving a considerable amount of luggage across difficult terrain. Edwina managed most of this organization herself, which was one of the things that people who knew her well noted consistently. Beneath the social ease and the spending, there was a precise and unsentimental administrative capability. She planned things. She followed up. When arrangements failed, she was not pleasant about it. The journey took them to places that most English people of their class encountered only through the reports of colonial administrators and the prose of travel writers. They moved through India's formal circuits, the governor's residences, the military installations, the organized entertainments that the Raj provided for visitors of sufficient rank. They were received with the elaborate hospitality that the colonial system extended to connected British visitors, which meant that what they saw of India was the version that had been arranged for their comfort. The poverty that existed a short distance from every residence they stayed in was not invisible. It was simply not part of the itinerary. Edwina's letters from this period, several of which survive, contain observations that are sometimes acute and sometimes remarkable for what they fail to notice. She describes landscapes with genuine attention. She records social interactions with the dry humor that characterized her private writing. She notes in one letter to a friend in London that the heat is extraordinary, and the food at a certain official function was organized with more ambition than skill. She does not, in the letters that have survived, spend much time on the conditions of the people who served the dinners or maintained the residences or carried the luggage. They appear in her correspondence as part of the scenery, present, functional, unnamed. This was not unusual for her class and time. It was, in fact, entirely typical. But it is worth noting, because the woman who would later become genuinely invested in humanitarian work, who would spend the last decade of her life in sustained, exhausting engagement with the conditions of ordinary people, was also the woman who moved through the British Empire in 1924 without appearing to register it as something that required examination. The later commitment was real. The earlier blindness was also real. Both things belonged to the same person. Louis, during these journeys, was in his natural habitat. He was photographed everywhere, engaged with everyone, and accumulated connections with the systematic energy of a man who understood that relationships were a form of capital. He was genuinely charming in the way that people who have grown up being the most interesting person in most rooms tend to be, practiced, quick, and slightly exhausting to those who observed it for extended periods. Naval officers who served with him during this period recorded, in their own accounts, a man of considerable intelligence and equally considerable ego, whose best qualities and most difficult ones were often inseparable. Between the official engagements, there were the private ones. Louis had friendships, close ones conducted with discretion, but not entirely without visibility to those paying attention. Edwina had begun by this point to develop her own. The accommodation they had reached before their wedding was functioning as designed. The cost of that functioning was distributed unevenly, as these arrangements tend to be, but neither of them was, in these early years, visibly suffering from it. They were too busy. The schedule made everything else a secondary consideration. In 1926, they were back in England for the birth of their first daughter, Patricia. The household absorbed the child, as it absorbed everything, efficiently, with appropriate staff, without significant disruption to the existing rhythm. Edwina was not indifferent to her daughter, but she was also not a woman whose identity reorganized itself around motherhood in the way that her social world would have found conventional. Patricia was cared for. She was also, from early on, largely in the care of others. Mary, in these same years, had married. Her husband was Henry Errington Silas, a figure who does not appear prominently in the historical record, which is itself a kind of information. The marriage was quiet, socially unremarkable by the standards of the world they had both been raised in, and produced children without producing much public documentation. Mary receded from the kind of visibility that her sister occupied almost continuously, and the recession was, on the surface, total. She appeared at family events. She maintained the connections appropriate to her position. She did not, in any record that has survived, complain about any of this. What the travel years produced in the end was a marriage that had found its operational form. Louis and Edwina functioned well together in public. They were entertaining, attractive, and socially effective as a pair. In private, they had established a distance that worked for both of them, most of the time. The fortune continued to fund the movement. The movement continued to make stillness unnecessary. The historical record does a particular thing to secondary figures. It does not erase them entirely. They appear in footnotes, in the background of photographs, in the occasional letter written by someone more documented than themselves, but it flattens them. It reduces a life to a handful of facts and a question mark. Mary Ashley, later Mary Delamere, is one of those figures. She was present at almost every significant event in her sister's public life. She left behind very little that is entirely her own. What can be reconstructed is this. Mary was born in 1906, 4 years after Edwina. She grew up in the same households, under the same conditions, with the same stepmother and the same distant father. She was educated similarly, finished similarly, and presented to the same social world at approximately the same time. But the fortune that came to Edwina from Castle's estate did not come to Mary in the same form. The settlement she received was comfortable. She was not poor, not by any ordinary measure. But it was not the kind of money that changes the temperature of a room when you walk into it. That particular quality belonged entirely to her sister. In the arithmetic of their world, this mattered enormously. Wealth at Edwina's scale attracted a specific kind of attention that had its own social gravity. Mary's position was more conventional, a well-born young woman with a reasonable income and good connections, navigating a marriage market that was perfectly willing to accommodate her, but had no particular reason to compete for her. The introductions made on her behalf were appropriate and unmemorable. The men considered suitable were solid, respectable, and undistinguished in the way that solid and respectable men in that world frequently were. She married in 1931. Her husband was the 4th Baron Delamere, Hugh Cholmondeley, a man whose family held significant land in Kenya and whose life was organized around the colonial farming interests that the Delamere name had represented in East Africa since the late 19th century. The match had a certain logic to it, a title, land, colonial standing, and the kind of established position that provided a frame for a life, even if the frame was not particularly flexible. What it required of Mary was relocation, not just to a different house, but to a different continent. Kenya in the 1930s was a particular kind of place, a particular kind of society, and it demanded a particular kind of adaptation. The world she entered in Kenya was the one that would later be documented with varying degrees of romanticism as the Happy Valley set. A loose community of white colonial settlers whose social life was distinguished by its insularity, its excess, and its elaborate indifference to the conditions of the African population, on whose labor the entire enterprise depended. Mary arrived at the edge of this world. Whether she occupied its center or its periphery depends on which account one reads, and the accounts are not consistent. What is consistent is that the social environment in which she found herself was one defined by isolation, geographic, cultural, and emotional, and that the marriage she had entered did not appear to offer much protection against it. Hugh Delamere was not a cruel man, by the accounts available. He was a man shaped by a world in which Kenyan land was a birthright, Kenyan labor was an operational resource, and the social life of the white settler community was the only social life that registered as real. He was busy with the farm, with colonial politics, with the management of an estate that required constant attention. Mary was expected to manage the household, participate in the social circuit, and adapt to conditions that bore no resemblance to Brooke House or the London seasons she had grown up in. Letters from this period, the few that have been made accessible, suggest a woman making the best of an arrangement that had not turned out to offer what she might have hoped. They are careful letters, careful in the specific way of someone who knows that what they write will be read by more than one person. She mentions the heat. She mentions the garden. She mentions visits from people whose names mean nothing outside the settler community. She asks after Edwina, and the questions have the quality of someone maintaining a connection that distance is slowly making abstract. Edwina visited Kenya once during this period briefly as part of a longer journey. The visit appears in Edwina's correspondence as a pleasant interlude, the landscape, the animals, the particular quality of East African light. Mary appears in it as a hostess, competent and welcoming in the background of her own house. Whether the two sisters spoke honestly during that visit about what their respective lives had become is not recorded. The letters written afterward do not suggest they did. Back in London and later in Malta, where Louis was posted in the late 1920s and 30s, Edwina's life continued at its established pace. The contrast with Mary's situation was not something that appears to have troubled Edwina's correspondence greatly. This is not an accusation. It is simply what the record shows. Edwina was not an ungenerous person, and later in her life she would demonstrate a capacity for genuine attention to suffering that many people found surprising given her background. But in these years, Mary's quieter difficulties did not appear to register as something requiring particular engagement. What the Delamere marriage produced structurally was a woman embedded in a world she had not chosen, in a country she had not grown up in, inside a social system that was already, though none of its participants recognized it fully, moving toward its own dissolution. The Happy Valley set would not survive the decade intact. The colonial farming economy on which the Delamere wealth depended would face pressures that no amount of social insularity could hold back. Mary had built her life on ground that was less stable than it appeared, and the fortune she had received, smaller than her sister's and now tied to land rather than liquid capital, gave her less room to move when the ground shifted. She had children. She maintained the household. She appeared at the correct events. The record of her inner life during this period is almost entirely absent, which is itself a kind of answer to the question of how much space she had been given to develop one. By the late 1920s, the Mountbatten marriage had settled into a form that functioned publicly and privately on entirely different terms. Publicly, Louis and Edwina were one of the most visible couples in British social life, photographed together at events, received together at official functions, described in the press with the consistent vocabulary of glamour that had attached itself to them since the wedding. Privately, they had long since ceased to operate as a conventional couple in any meaningful sense. They were allies. They were, in their particular way, genuinely fond of each other. They were not, with any regularity, intimate. The affairs on both sides were not secrets, not within the circles that mattered, which is to say not among the people who attended the same parties and stayed in the same country houses and read the same private correspondence. Louis's attachments were known. Edwina's were known. The convention that governed such arrangements required only that they not become publicly documented, that they not produce scandal, and that they not interfere with the operational requirements of the marriage itself. As long as those conditions held, the arrangement was considered, by the standards of their world, unremarkable. Edwina's relationship with the actor and singer Paul Robeson began sometime in the early 1930s and was, by the measures available, the most emotionally significant attachment of that decade of her life. Robeson was, by 1933, internationally famous. His performances in Showboat and his concert career had made him one of the most recognized artists in the English-speaking world. He was also black, American, and politically engaged in ways that made him a target for exactly the kind of establishment that Edwina's marriage had placed her at the center of. The relationship was known in London society. It was discussed in private letters, in club conversations, and in the careful language that people used when they wanted to convey information, without being documented as having conveyed it. It was also for a period the subject of active management by people connected to the palace and to Louis's naval superiors, who understood that public exposure would produce consequences extending well beyond the personal. Louis was by this point a senior naval officer with serious ambitions. The relationship between his wife and a black American communist sympathizer, which is how Robeson was characterized in the Security Service's internal documents, was not a manageable public narrative. Whether pressure was applied directly to Edwina or whether she made the calculations herself is not entirely clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that the relationship continued quietly, and that its continuation required a level of discretion that imposed its own costs. Robeson visited. He did not visit openly. Edwina saw him in circumstances that required planning and management. The practical logistics of maintaining a significant emotional connection under those conditions. The arranging, the concealing, the perpetual awareness that exposure would carry serious consequences, are not romantic. They are exhausting. Louis's attachments during this period were, in a structural sense, less complicated. The women he was involved with moved within his social world, shared his background, and did not carry the political charge that Robeson represented. His relationships required discretion, but not the same quality of risk management. This asymmetry, the fact that Edwina's choices consistently carried higher stakes than Louis's, is visible in the record, though it was not discussed in those terms at the time. In 1934, a story reached the American press. A New York scandal sheet published a piece implying a relationship between Edwina and Robeson. The story was specific enough to be damaging and vague enough to be deniable. Edwina and Louis responded by suing for libel, a decision that required them to appear in court together, present themselves as an affronted couple, and pursue the case publicly in a way that drew considerably more attention to the original story than it might otherwise have received. They won. The publication settled and issued a retraction. The legal victory was clean and unambiguous. It also required Edwina to stand in a courtroom and implicitly deny something that people in her social circle knew to be at least partially true. The gap between the public performance and the private reality was not new in her life, but this particular instance of it was unusually formal. The denial was entered into the legal record. It was there permanently. Louis's conduct throughout the libel case was, by the accounts of those present, impeccable. He was supportive, composed, and entirely convincing as an affronted husband. Whether this was because he was a skilled performer, because he genuinely felt the public challenge to the marriage's appearance required a defense regardless of its private reality, or some combination of the two, is not possible to determine from the outside. He understood clearly that the marriage's public credibility was an asset that required maintenance. He maintained it. After the case, the social landscape shifted slightly. The Robeson relationship did not end entirely, but it became more carefully managed. Edwina's movements during periods when Robeson was in London were noted and discussed in certain quarters. The security services, who had been monitoring Robeson since at least the early 30s, continued to maintain files in which Edwina appeared as a connected figure. Those files were not made public for decades. Mary, in Kenya, was too far from these events to have been significantly involved in them, though she was certainly aware of what had happened. Her letters from this period contain no mention of the libel case or its implications. This silence is not unusual. Mary's letters were generally careful, but its completeness across this particular subject suggests a deliberate avoidance. She had enough difficulty managing the appearances of her own life without taking on the complications of her sister's. What the affair and the libel case produced in the long structure of Edwina's life was a clarification. The arrangement she had entered at 21 was not simply a private accommodation between two consenting adults. It was a system with external stakeholders, the Navy, the palace, the press, the legal establishment, who had their own interests in how it was managed. Edwina's freedom to conduct her private life was real, but bounded by forces that had nothing to do with her own preferences. The boundaries were invisible until she reached them. Then they were very clear. The Second World War arrived in Edwina Mountbatten's life as it arrived in most lives of her class and generation. First, as a political deterioration that had been visible for years to anyone paying attention, and then, in September 1939, as a formal condition that reorganized everything. Louis returned immediately to active naval service. Edwina, who had spent the preceding years moving between houses, continents, and social obligations with a restlessness that had become indistinguishable from her personality, now had something specific to do. She did it with an intensity that surprised people who had categorized her primarily as a society figure. She trained as a nurse, not ceremonially, not in the way that wealthy women of her background sometimes attach their names to medical organizations without significantly altering their daily lives, but practically attending courses, acquiring qualifications, and making herself useful in ways that required her to be present in rooms where the distance between her circumstances and those of the people she was helping was very large and very visible. She worked for the St. John Ambulance Brigade, eventually rising to become its superintendent-in-chief. The role was administrative as well as practical, and Edwina was, as she had always been, a precise and demanding administrator. The work suited something in her that the preceding years had not fully engaged. The social circuit, the travel, the management of large households, these had occupied her time without requiring much of her. The war work required concentration, decision-making, and a tolerance for conditions that were genuinely difficult. She visited bomb sites in London during the Blitz, walking through streets where buildings had been reduced to rubble the night before, assessing what was needed and directing resources accordingly. She was photographed doing this, which was part of her role. The visibility of a woman of her name and position in those circumstances carried a morale value that the organization she worked with understood. But the photographs do not fully account for the hours she was there when no one was taking photographs. Her health during this period was already showing signs of the deterioration that would accelerate in the decade that followed. She had been a physically restless person her entire adult life. The travel, the social schedule, the perpetual motion, and the wartime work added to an existing load rather than replacing it. She slept badly. She ate irregularly. She pushed through fatigue in the way of someone who has decided, at some level not entirely accessible to conscious examination, that stopping is more dangerous than continuing. Louis, meanwhile, had suffered a significant reversal. In May 1941, HMS Kelly, the destroyer he commanded, was sunk off the coast of Crete by German aircraft. The sinking cost the lives of over half the crew. Louis survived, pulled from the water after the ship went down. The event became, in the way of such things, part of his public narrative, the commander who went down with his ship and survived. And it was later dramatized in Noel Coward's film, In Which We Serve, in which Coward played a character transparently based on Louis. The film was a significant wartime success. What the film did not dramatize was the internal Navy inquiry that followed the Kelly's loss, which raised questions about the decisions made in the hours before the sinking. The inquiry did not formally censure Louis, but it produced documentation suggesting that his tactical choices had been, at minimum, debatable. This documentation was not widely circulated at the time. Louis's public reputation emerged from the Kelly intact, burnished even, while the questions it raised within naval circles were managed quietly and did not reach the newspapers. Edwina was aware of the inquiry. She was aware of most things that concerned Louis's career, partly because she had been, throughout their marriage, a careful student of the institutional world he operated in, and partly because the social network that connected them to the Navy's senior figures was one she maintained actively. What she made of the gap between Lewis's public narrative and the internal record is not something she committed to paper, at least not in documents that have survived. By 1943, Lewis had been appointed Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia, a role of considerable strategic importance that placed him in command of operations across a vast theater based primarily in Ceylon. The appointment was, by any measure, an extraordinary one for a man of his age and the still contested aspects of his recent record. It owed something to his operational capabilities, which were genuine. It owed something also to his royal connections, his relationship with Churchill, and the kind of institutional confidence that accrues to men who present themselves well in the rooms where decisions are made. Edwina followed him to Southeast Asia, not immediately but within months, in her capacity with the St. John Ambulance and the Red Cross. What she found there, whether in the military hospitals, the prisoner of war camps being liberated at the end of the war, the transit facilities processing hundreds of thousands of people displaced by years of conflict and was suffering on a scale that her wartime work in London had not prepared her for. She moved through these facilities with a systematic attention that the relief organizations she worked with documented carefully. Officers who observed her in this period recorded a woman who asked specific questions, remembered specific answers, and followed up on specific problems with a persistence that was sometimes uncomfortable for the people responsible for addressing them. She was thin, she was visibly fatigued. She continued. The combination of genuine engagement and physical depletion was not accidental. The work gave her something that the rest of her life, for all its material abundance, had not consistently provided. A reason to be in a specific place that had nothing to do with social obligation or the maintenance of appearances. Whether she recognized this about herself is uncertain. What is visible in the record is that she worked harder in these years than in any preceding period of her life, and that the harder she worked, the less she seemed to rest. Patricia, her eldest daughter, was a teenager during these years, largely in England in the care of staff and the supervision of relatives. Pamela, the younger daughter, was a child. The distance between Southeast Asia and an English schoolroom was not only geographic. In February 1947, Clement Attlee's government announced that Lord Louis Mountbatten would be appointed the last Viceroy of India, with a mandate to oversee the transfer of power from British to Indian hands by a deadline that was, by the standards of such things, extraordinarily compressed. The British had been in India in one administrative form or another for nearly 2 centuries. They were now being asked to leave in a matter of months. Louis accepted the appointment with the enthusiasm of a man who understood that it was the largest stage he had yet been offered. Edwina went with him. This was not automatic. The role of vicereine was ceremonial in the traditional sense, organized around official entertainments, formal appearances, and the management of the vast social machinery of the Viceroy's house in New Delhi. It was, in other words, precisely the kind of role that the preceding decades of Edwina's life had equipped her to perform, and that she had spent those same decades finding insufficient. What changed the calculation was the humanitarian dimension of what was about to happen. The transfer of power would produce displacement, violence, and suffering on a scale that relief organizations were already anticipating and for which no adequate preparation existed. Edwina understood this. She went. The Viceroy's house, Lutyens' vast, geometrically precise monument to imperial self-confidence, received them in March 1947. The building was designed to make its occupants feel significant. It succeeded. Staff ran to several hundred. The gardens were maintained by teams of workers whose daily labor was required to keep the grounds in the condition that official photographs demanded. The distance between the house and the conditions of ordinary Delhi was, in every measurable sense, enormous. Edwina registered this distance. It did not, in these early weeks, appear to produce any significant disruption to the schedule of official functions that the role required. Jawaharlal Nehru came to dinner in late March. He was 60 years old, recently released from the last of many prison terms served under British detention, and within months of becoming the first Prime Minister of an independent India. He was also, by most accounts, one of the most compelling figures that anyone who met him during this period could recall encountering. He was educated at Harrow and Cambridge, had spent significant portions of his adult life in British prisons reading and writing, and had emerged from those years with a quality of attention, focused, unhurried, capable of making the person he was talking with feel that nothing else existed for him at that moment. That was unusual in people who had not been through comparable experiences. Edwina sat next to him at dinner. By the accounts of people present, the conversation began conventionally and became, within an hour, something considerably less so. They talked about India, about the transfer, about what independence would require and what it would cost. Nehru asked her questions that assumed she had opinions worth hearing, which was not the experience she generally had at official functions with men in equivalent positions to his. She had opinions. She expressed them. He responded to them seriously. What developed over the following weeks and months was a relationship that defies the categories available for it. It was not a conventional affair, though whether it was physically intimate at any point is something that biographers have debated without resolution, and the principals left no documentation that settles the question. It was more than a friendship in the ordinary sense. The letters they exchanged over the following years, running to hundreds of pages, have the emotional register of something considerably more central to both their lives than friendship typically occupies. Nehru's daughter Indira, who observed the relationship closely and had complicated feelings about it, described it in later years as the most important relationship of her father's later life. For Edwina, what it offered was something she had not had before in any relationship: a person who engaged her intellectually and emotionally with equal seriousness, who did not require her to perform a role, and whose interest in her was entirely independent of her fortune, her title, or her social position. Nehru did not need anything from her. He was about to become the leader of the world's most populous democracy. The things she could offer, money, access, social influence, were not things he required. He talked to her because he found her interesting. She found this, at 46, remarkable. The partition of August 1947 arrived with the violence that everyone with knowledge of the situation had anticipated, and that the compressed timeline had made worse. The drawing of the border between India and Pakistan produced one of the largest forced migrations in recorded history. Estimates range between 10 and 20 million people displaced in a matter of weeks, with sectarian killing on a scale that overwhelmed every relief capacity that existed. Edwina moved into this catastrophe with the systematic attention she had brought to the Southeast Asian hospitals 2 years earlier, now operating at an entirely different scale. She traveled to the camps. She went to the border regions where the displacement was occurring. She was photographed repeatedly in conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Not dangerous in the theatrical sense that official visits to difficult situations sometimes manufacture, but actually dangerous in places where organized violence was ongoing and the presence of a vicereine provided no reliable protection. She pushed relief organizations to move faster, pressured officials who were moving slowly, and maintained a correspondence with Nehru about the humanitarian situation that was practical in its content and deeply personal in its register. Louis, managing the political transfer from Government House, was operating under pressures that were entirely different in character. The lines he was drawing, the compromises he was negotiating, the decisions about where the border would run, these were the decisions that would produce the displacement Edwina was now working to address. The two of them were operating simultaneously on opposite sides of the same catastrophe. Whether either of them fully absorbed this at the time is not clear. The correspondence between them from this period is businesslike. Indian independence was declared on August 15, 1947. Nehru's speech delivered at midnight in the Indian Parliament is among the most documented moments of the 20th century. Edwina was present. She stood in the official position of vicereine in the building that had been designed to represent British power over India, and watched India become independent. What she felt during those hours she did not record in any document that has survived. Patricia Mountbatten was born in February 1924, in the first year of her parents' marriage, into a household that was already moving at a pace incompatible with sustained domestic attention. She was the first child, which carried its own weight, the visible evidence of a marriage that was functioning, at least formally, as marriages were supposed to function. She was photographed as an infant with her mother, and the photographs were published, and the public narrative of the Mountbatten family acquired a new element. Then the household resumed its schedule. Pamela, the second daughter, arrived in April 1929. By this point, the pattern was established. The Mountbatten children grew up in houses that were very large and very well staffed, with parents who were frequently absent, and when present often engaged with obligations that took priority over the kind of sustained parental attention that produces, in children, a settled sense of their own centrality to their parents' lives. This is not an unusual condition for children of their class and era. Nannies, governesses, and the structures of the English boarding school system existed precisely to manage the gap between parental absence and children's needs. The system was designed to make the absence invisible. It did not always succeed. Patricia, as the elder daughter, occupied a position in the family structure that carried its own particular pressures. She was the one expected to be capable, composed, and representative, the child who appeared in official photographs with a composure that suggested she had been trained, from early on, to understand that certain occasions required a performance of contentment, regardless of what was actually felt. People who knew her in childhood describe a girl who was watchful and careful, who learned quickly what was expected and provided it, and who maintained a controlled surface that made it difficult to know what lay beneath. The years of the Second World War were the years of Patricia's adolescence. Her father was at sea commanding destroyers, and then in Southeast Asia commanding a theater. Her mother was in London during the Blitz, then in Southeast Asia with the relief organizations, then in India for the partition and independence. Patricia was in England in the care of staff, attending school and absorbing the specific lesson that wartime children of absent parents absorb: that the reasons for the absence are important and legitimate, and that the feelings produced by the absence are not something to be expressed openly because there is no one present to receive them. Letters between Patricia and her mother during these years are, where they survive, careful. Edwina wrote with affection and with the particular quality of attention that someone who is thinking about another person while managing enormous logistical pressures gives to correspondence, present in intention, abbreviated in execution. Patricia's replies are similarly careful. She reports on school. She mentions friends. She does not, in the letters that have been made available, tell her mother what she actually feels about any of it. Pamela, 5 years younger, experienced the same conditions at a younger age, which meant that the parental absence was a more foundational element of her early experience, rather than something that interrupted an already established relationship. She has written about her childhood in published memoirs with a candor that her sister did not, and what she records is not bitterness exactly. It is something more complicated, a description of a childhood that was materially extraordinary and emotionally incomplete, in which affection was real, but presence was not. The houses were significant. Broadlands, the Mountbatten estate in Hampshire, Edwina's by inheritance, substantial by any measure, was the physical backdrop of their childhood. It was a house designed for entertaining, for official purposes, for the projection of a certain kind of English grandeur. It was also the house they grew up in, which meant that the scale of the rooms, the number of staff, and the general orientation of the household toward external obligation rather than internal life were simply the conditions of their existence. A child who grows up in a house that size learns early that the house is not organized around them. In 1946, Patricia married John Knatchbull, later Lord Brabourne, a practical, steady man who worked in film production and who provided, by all accounts, the kind of consistent domestic presence that her own childhood had not. The marriage was stable and produced 7 children. Patricia became, in her adult life, the organized, capable, emotionally controlled figure that her childhood had prepared her to be. She managed the family's affairs with precision. She was her father's closest confidant in his later years. She protected the family's public reputation with a thoroughness that occasionally shaded into what observers described carefully as management. What she felt about her mother is a more difficult question. Edwina died when Patricia was 35, old enough to have formed a complete picture of who her mother was, young enough that the relationship had not had time to develop into the more equitable form that some parent-child relationships find in later life. The accounts Patricia gave of her mother in subsequent years were uniformly positive, describing a woman of extraordinary capability and genuine compassion. Whether the uniformity of the praise reflects the truth of her feelings or the training of a lifetime in the presentation of appropriate surfaces is not something the record settles. Pamela, in her memoirs, is more textured. She describes a mother who was capable of sudden, focused warmth, who could, when she was present, make the person with her feel entirely seen, and who was also capable of disappearing for months into obligations that left no space for the people who needed her closer. She describes learning as a child, not to need too much. This is a specific skill, learned in specific conditions, and it leaves specific marks. The relationship between the two daughters was close and protective in the way of siblings who have shared conditions that were difficult and have agreed, without discussing it, not to discuss it. They appeared together at official events, supported each other's families, and maintained the public face of a family that had been, beneath its considerable glamour, significantly fractured. The fracture was not dramatic. It was the quieter kind, the kind that comes from long absence and managed surfaces and affection that was real but consistently interrupted before it could become something fully sustaining. The Kenya that Mary Delamere had moved into in the early 1930s was, by the late 1940s, a place under visible strain. The certainties that had organized the white settler community, land ownership, labor arrangements, political representation structured entirely around the minority population, were being pressured by forces that the community itself was poorly equipped to analyze, because doing so would have required acknowledging the nature of what they had built. The Mau Mau uprising, which began in earnest in the early 1950s, made the pressure explicit and violent. The world Mary had married into was not simply changing, it was being contested at a fundamental level by the people whose exclusion had made it possible in the first place. Hugh Delamere, the fourth Baron, died in 1944. He had been ill for some time, and his death, while not unexpected, left Mary in a position that was structurally precarious in ways that had not been fully visible while he was alive. The Delamere estate, the land, the farming operations, the colonial infrastructure that the family name represented in Kenya passed to his son from a previous marriage. Mary received what the legal arrangements provided for her, which was a settlement that the lawyers described as appropriate, and that left her, in practical terms, in a house in Kenya with a reduced income. A social position that was tied entirely to a family she was no longer legally central to, and connections that were useful only within a colonial community that was itself losing its footing. She remained in Kenya for several years after Hugh's death, which is itself a piece of information. She had nowhere more obvious to go. England was not a straightforward return. She had been gone for over a decade. The social world she had grown up in had reorganized itself around people and events she had not been present for, and the fortune that might have made re-entry into London society effortless was not hers in the form it would have needed to be. Edwina was in India, managing the largest political transition of the century. Mary was in Nairobi, managing a household that no longer had the backing it had operated on. The financial situation deteriorated over time in the specific way of situations involving colonial land and disputed inheritance. Slowly at first, then with a gathering momentum that becomes difficult to reverse once it has begun. There were legal questions about the estate, there were questions about what Mary was owed and what she had actually received. These questions were addressed through lawyers, through correspondence, through the particular grinding machinery of inheritance disputes that can continue for years without resolution, and during which the people involved must continue to live their daily lives as though the question is not constantly present. Her children, she had a son and a daughter from the marriage, were growing up during this period in conditions that were complicated by the financial uncertainty and by the political situation surrounding them. The Mau Mau emergency declared in 1952, brought violence to the Kenyan highlands that affected settler families directly. The Delamere lands were not immune. The sense of security that colonial land ownership was supposed to provide, the deep territorial certainty that had been the central promise of that world, was no longer available in the form that the community had relied on. Mary made trips to England during this period. The visits were not triumphant returns. She stayed with family, appeared at the events she was invited to, and returned to Kenya without having resolved whatever it was she had come to resolve. Edwina was by this point back in England, living between Broadlands and her various other obligations, and the two sisters saw each other with the frequency that proximity allows, but that busyness consistently reduces. The letters between them from the early 1950s have a quality of mutual maintenance. Two people checking in on each other across a distance that is not only geographic. What the financial disputes ultimately produced over the course of the 1950s was a gradual erosion of Mary's position that was difficult to arrest because it operated on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Kenyan estate was generating less income as the political situation made farming operations more difficult, and as the legal questions about the inheritance remained unresolved. Her personal resources, always more limited than her sister's, were being depleted by legal costs and by the simple expense of maintaining a life in two countries without a stable financial base in either. She began drinking. This is documented in the accounts of people who knew her during this period, though it is documented with the discretion that those accounts generally apply to uncomfortable facts about people they are otherwise disposed to speak well of. The drinking was not hidden exactly, but it was not acknowledged directly. It was managed in the way that such things are managed in families that have been trained to manage appearances, noted, worried about privately, and not discussed in terms that would require anyone to act on what they were observing. Her daughter has spoken in interviews about this period with a carefulness that suggests she is still, decades later, navigating the question of what to say about it. She describes her mother as a woman who was under pressure and who did not have the resources, financial, emotional, or social, to absorb that pressure without visible cost. This is a generous framing. It is also, in its specific details, accurate. By the mid-1950s, Mary's position in Kenya had become untenable in the practical sense. The political trajectory of the country was clear enough to anyone paying attention. Independence was coming, the settler community's arrangements were not going to survive it intact, and the land-based wealth that the Delamere name represented would not transfer smoothly into whatever came next. She was not alone in this assessment. The white settler community was beginning the process of slow dispersal that would accelerate in the following decade. But most of the people dispersing had resources that made dispersal a choice rather than a compulsion. She returned to England permanently in the late 1950s. The Kenya chapter of her life had lasted over 2 decades and had produced in material terms considerably less than it had taken from her. The legal disputes over the Delamere estate followed her. The drinking continued. She was in her early 50s in poor health, with a reduced income and a social position that required constant maintenance to remain legible to the world it was addressed to. Edwina, in these same years, was dying, not slowly enough for anyone to fully absorb it, and not quickly enough for anyone to stop her from continuing. The relief work that Edwina had begun during the war and continued through the partition of India had, by the early 1950s, become the organizing principle of her public life. She held senior positions in the St. John Ambulance Brigade, the Save the Children Fund, and a range of other organizations whose work addressed poverty, disease, and displacement in parts of the world that the people attending her fundraising dinners in London rarely visited. She traveled constantly to the Caribbean, to Southeast Asia, to East Africa, to the Indian subcontinent, inspecting facilities, meeting local officials, and producing reports that the organizations she worked with described as unusually specific and operationally useful. The work was real. This requires stating directly because the temptation, when examining the humanitarian activities of very wealthy people, is to reduce them entirely to performance, to assume that the giving is primarily about the giver's public image and that the suffering being addressed is incidental to the transaction. In Edwina's case, the evidence does not support that reduction. The hours she put in were not hours that served any obvious social purpose. The places she went were not places that generated useful press coverage in the publications her social world read. Officers of the relief organizations she worked with recorded in their internal documents. A woman who understood the operational details of what she was funding and who asked questions that indicated she had read the reports she was sent rather than pass them to a secretary. And yet, the work also served purposes that were not purely external. The movement it required, the constant travel, the full schedules, the perpetual arrival in places where the immediate demands of the situation left no space for reflection, was structurally identical to the restlessness that had organized her life since the early years of her marriage. She had always moved quickly. The question of what she was moving away from had never been fully examined, partly because the pace she maintained made examination difficult, and partly because the activities she was moving between were, increasingly, genuinely important. It is harder to stop a person who is doing necessary work than it is to stop one who is not. Her correspondence with Nehru continued throughout this period. He had been Prime Minister of India since independence, managing a country of extraordinary complexity with the particular combination of idealism and pragmatism that his political biography had shaped. The letters they exchanged, several hundred survive, though not all have been made fully public, ranged across politics, literature, philosophy, and the personal. He wrote about the pressures of governance with a candor that suggested he found in her a correspondent who would not repeat what he said and who had opinions worth hearing in return. She wrote about her work, about the people she encountered in the field, about the conditions she observed in countries that were managing post-colonial transitions of their own. The letters were, among other things, an emotional life conducted at a distance, a sustained intimacy that did not require physical presence and that could not be disrupted by the ordinary frictions of shared domestic existence. Nehru had his political world in Delhi. Edwina had her organizational world in London, and her perpetual movement between field visits. The relationship existed in the space between those worlds, in correspondence, in the occasional visits when they were in the same city, in the quality of attention each brought to what the other wrote. It was, in its structure, perfectly suited to two people who were better at sustained engagement than sustained presence. Lewis, by the early 1950s, was First Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy, the position his father had held before being forced out by anti-German sentiment during the First World War. Lewis had wanted the position for decades, and his path to it had been neither straightforward nor universally supported within the Navy. There were officers who questioned his judgment, who found his self-promotion excessive, who felt that his royal connections had carried him past points where his professional record alone would have stalled. He occupied the position with the visible satisfaction of someone who had been told, at various points, that he would not reach it. He and Edwina maintained the public form of their marriage with the practiced ease of people who had been doing it for 30 years. They appeared together at official functions. They were photographed together at Broadlands. The household continued to operate. In private, they were, by all accounts, living largely separate lives that intersected at the points that official obligations required. This was not hostile. It was simply the settled arrangement of a marriage that had found its form early and had not significantly changed since. The finances in the 1950s were more complicated than they had been. Edwina's fortune, Cassell's fortune, which had passed to her in 1921 had been substantial enough to fund 3 decades of extraordinary expenditure without being exhausted, but it was not inexhaustible, and the running costs of Broadlands and the other properties, combined with the expenses of the relief work travel and the social obligations of Lewis's senior naval positions, were considerable. There were conversations about the estates, about what could be maintained, what might need to be reduced. These conversations were not urgent, but they were happening. Broadlands itself was a particular problem. The house was too large for its current use, too expensive to maintain fully, and too significant, historically, architecturally, symbolically, to be easily reduced or disposed of. It had been in Edwina's family since the 18th century, had been visited by royalty, had hosted events that appeared in the history books. What do you do with a house like that when the fortune that built it is no longer the size it was? The question did not have a clean answer, and in the 1950s no one was required to answer it yet. That requirement would come later, and it would fall on people other than Edwina. Her health, through all of this, was declining in ways that her schedule did not accommodate. She was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night. She was eating irregularly. She was traveling across multiple time zones on a rhythm that would have been demanding for someone 20 years younger and in full health. Doctors told her to rest. She thanked them and left for the next engagement. The organization she worked for were grateful. The people she met in the field and were in the hospitals and camps and transit facilities remembered her with an affection that had nothing performative about it. The reports she filed were acted on. The work mattered, and she kept moving. In the spring of 1958, Edwina Mountbatten collapsed during a public engagement. The details of the collapse were managed carefully by the people around her. It was attributed, in the account given to the press, to exhaustion and the demands of her schedule, which was true as far as it went. What it did not convey was the degree to which the collapse was not an isolated incident, but a visible point in a deterioration that had been accumulating for years, and that the people closest to her had been watching with increasing concern and decreasing ability to interrupt. She was 57 years old. She had been moving at the pace she had set for herself since the early years of her marriage, modified by circumstances, intensified by the war and its aftermath, never significantly reduced. The physical cost of that pace was not invisible to her doctors, who had been telling her with growing directness that her cardiovascular system was under strain that rest might partially address, and that continued activity at her current level would not. She understood what they were telling her. She did not dispute it. She simply did not organize her life around it. The collapse produced a brief interruption. She reduced her schedule for several weeks, stayed at Broadlands, and conducted her correspondence from there rather than in person. Nehru wrote. She replied with her customary attention, noting the enforced stillness with the dry humor that characterized her private writing, and making clear that she intended to resume full activity as soon as it was medically possible to do so. There is no record that she considered any alternative. Lewis was First Sea Lord during this period, operating at the peak of his institutional influence and moving through his own demanding schedule with the energy of a man who had organized his entire adult life around professional achievement and was now, at last, occupying the position he had spent decades pursuing. He was attentive to Edwina's situation in the way available to someone whose own obligations allowed periodic attention rather than sustained presence. He visited Broadlands, he wrote. He was, by the accounts of people around them, genuinely concerned. He was also structurally unable to reorganize his life around her condition, in the way that a different kind of marriage might have made possible. Patricia managed the practical dimensions of her mother's recovery with the organized efficiency that had characterized her approach to everything involving the family. She coordinated with the doctors, ensured the household ran appropriately, and provided the kind of steady, capable presence that the situation required. She did not, in the accounts available, attempt to address the underlying question of why her mother was in this condition, or to suggest that the recovery period might be an opportunity to examine the pattern that had produced the collapse. This was not obtuseness. It was the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime of watching her mother, and the understanding that certain conversations would not be received. Pamela, less involved in the practical management, was more candid in the observations she recorded later. She noted that the period of enforced rest at Broadlands produced in her mother a visible restlessness that had a quality of distress about it. That stillness, for Edwina, was not recuperative in the way it is for most people, but was instead experienced as something closer to deprivation. She was not a person who knew how to be in a house without an agenda. The absence of an agenda produced an anxiety that expressed itself as impatience with the doctors, with the schedule constraints, with the general condition of having to be in one place. What the house contained, when she was forced to be present in it without the buffer of constant activity, was the accumulated weight of 35 years of a particular kind of life. The rooms at Broadlands were full of objects, gifts, acquisitions, inherited pieces, photographs, correspondence, the material residue of a life lived at considerable scale. They were not rooms that invited reflection. They were rooms organized around display, around the receiving of guests, around the social functions that the house had always been used for. Being in them without guests, without function, without the forward motion of an itinerary, required a relationship with the space that the space itself was not designed to support. She resumed her schedule in the autumn of 1958 on a timeline that her doctors considered premature. The first major engagement after her return was a tour of Caribbean territories on behalf of the St. John Ambulance. Several weeks of travel, inspections, and official functions conducted in a climate that was not, for someone in her cardiovascular condition, medically advisable. She completed it. The reports she filed were thorough. The people she met remembered her warmth and her attention. The correspondence with Nehru resumed its full rhythm. His letters from this period have been described by those who have read them as among the most personally revealing he wrote to anyone. A man of extraordinary self-discipline, allowing himself, in this particular exchange, a candor about his own exhaustion and loneliness that he did not permit himself in other contexts. He was 69 in 1958, managing a country of rapidly increasing complexity, with a staff and a political situation that demanded everything he had. He wrote to Edwina about the weight of it with a directness that suggests she was, by this point, the person he trusted most to receive that information, without using it. She wrote back with equal candor about her own condition, the health, the fatigue, the question she did not quite ask directly, but that ran beneath several of the letters from this period, what the movement was for, now that she was no longer able to maintain it at the pace she had set. She did not reach a conclusion. The letters are not the letters of someone who has found resolution. They are the letters of someone thinking aloud to a person they trust, in the knowledge that the thinking will not be interrupted or redirected or managed. Louis retired as First Sea Lord in 1959 and was appointed Chief of the Defense Staff, a new position, created partly to accommodate him, that placed him at the head of all three armed services. The appointment was not without controversy. There were people in the defense establishment who felt the position had been shaped around his ambitions rather than around genuine institutional need. Louis occupied it with the same visible satisfaction he had brought to every senior position he had held. Edwina began planning her next field tour in the final months of 1959. It would take her to Borneo. The tour of North Borneo that Edwina Mountbatten undertook in February 1960 was organized, as her field tours always were, with practical purpose. She was traveling on behalf of the St. John Ambulance Brigade, inspecting facilities, meeting local officials, and assessing the operational needs of the organization's work in the territory. North Borneo was in 1960 still a British protectorate, one of the remaining pieces of the colonial administrative structure that was across Asia and Africa in various stages of dissolution. The St. John work there was genuine, and the inspection was necessary. These facts are worth stating because they are true, and because they coexist with the other fact, which is that Edwina's doctors had advised her, with considerable directness, not to make the trip. She was 58 years old. The cardiovascular deterioration that had produced the 1958 collapse had not reversed during the intervening period. It had continued at the pace that such deteriorations follow when the conditions producing them are not meaningfully altered. Her heart was under strain that rest might have partially addressed. She had not rested. She had completed the Caribbean tour, resumed her London schedule, maintained her organizational responsibilities, and continued her correspondence with Nehru, which had, in the months before her departure for Borneo, taken on a quality that people who later read it described as valedictory, not in the sense that she was announcing anything, but in the sense that both of them seemed, in these letters, to be paying a particular quality of attention to what they were saying to each other. She departed in early February. The journey to North Borneo in 1960 involved multiple flights and considerable time in transit, passing through climates and altitudes that were not, for someone in her condition, medically inconsequential. She arrived in Jesselton, the capital, now called Kota Kinabalu, and began the tour on schedule. The officials who received her recorded a woman who was visibly tired, but entirely focused on what she had come to do. She asked the right questions. She examined the facilities with the attention that her organizational reports had always demonstrated. She was, by all external measures, functioning. On the evening of February 20th, she attended a dinner given by the governor of North Borneo. The accounts of people present describe a normal official dinner, the kind of event that had been a constant of her adult life, organized around the social protocols that she had navigated since childhood, requiring the performance of engagement and interest across a table of people whose company she had not chosen. She performed it. She returned to her room in the government rest house afterwards. She was found dead the following morning, February 21st, 1960. The cause of death was recorded as a cerebral thrombosis, a blood clot consistent with the cardiovascular deterioration her doctors had been monitoring for years. She had died in her sleep, alone in a government rest house in a British protectorate on the far side of the world, in the middle of a working tour. There was no dramatic final conversation, no deathbed reconciliation, no gathered family. There was a bed in a borrowed room and the silence of an early tropical morning. Louis was in London when the news reached him. The notification came through official channels, as notifications do when a person of sufficient public standing dies abroad. He was, by the accounts of people with him that day, devastated in a way that surprised those who had categorized the marriage primarily through its publicly known arrangements. Whatever the marriage had been and whatever it had not been, it had lasted 38 years and had been the organizing structure of both their adult lives. The loss of that structure, arriving as a telephone call on an ordinary morning, produced in him a grief that was visible and sustained. Patricia was informed. Pamela was informed. The official machinery of death, the notifications, the arrangements, the repatriation of the body began operating with the efficiency that such machinery brings to bear when the person who has died is sufficiently prominent. Edwina's body was flown back to England. The funeral was organized. The letters of condolence arrived in numbers that required a dedicated staff to manage. Nehru in Delhi received the news and did not speak publicly about it for several days. When he did in a statement to the Indian Parliament, he spoke about her humanitarian work and her role in the independence transition with a formality that was appropriate to the occasion and that gave no indication of what the private loss was. His daughter Indira, who had observed the relationship between them for over a decade, with feelings that had not always been uncomplicated, later described her father in the weeks following Edwina's death as a man who had lost something he could not replace and who did not permit himself to say so. He had kept her letters, all of them, through years of political crisis, imprisonment threats, and the constant demands of governing a nation of 400 million people. He had kept every letter she had written him. They were found in his study after his own death in 1964, bound and organized, which is itself a form of statement. The funeral took place in England at Romsey Abbey near Broadlands. It was attended by the expected assembly of official figures, family, and representatives of the organizations she had worked with. Nehru sent a wreath. The gesture was noted in the press with the oblique vocabulary that the English press used in 1960 for relationships it understood but could not directly describe. There was one additional element which Edwina had specified in her instructions. She had asked to be buried at sea. The request was granted. Her coffin was carried aboard HMS Wakeful and committed to the waters of the Solent. A frigate from the Indian Navy, INS Trishul, was present, sent on Nehru's personal instruction to represent India at the burial of a woman who had been, in the years of transition, something that the formal record of that transition does not fully account for. The ship stood offshore. The ceremony was conducted. The sea closed over the coffin in the manner that the sea closes over everything it receives. Without ceremony, without pause, without any acknowledgement that what it has taken was different from anything else. Broadlands passed to Patricia after Edwina's death, as the terms of the inheritance required. It was a house of approximately 60 rooms set in several hundred acres of Hampshire parkland, with a staff whose maintenance costs alone ran to a figure that required regular financial examination. It had been in the family since the 18th century. Palmerston had lived there, and Prince Albert had visited. The grounds had been landscaped by Capability Brown, or by someone working in his manor, which amounted to much the same thing in terms of the ongoing cost of maintaining them. It was, by any external measure, one of the significant country houses of southern England. It was also, by 1960, a problem. The fortune that had funded Broadland's operation since Edwina inherited it in 1921 had been substantial enough, for long enough, that the question of its sustainability had been deferred through several decades of expenditure that might otherwise have prompted earlier examination. Castle's £6 million, accumulated through a lifetime of financial precision, had passed to a woman who spent with an energy that matched her grandfather's accumulation. The war work, the travel, the philanthropic activities, the maintenance of multiple properties, the social obligations of Lewis's senior positions, none of these were cheap, and the fortune had been funding them continuously for 39 years. What remained was not nothing, but what remained was also not enough to operate Broadlands as it had been operated indefinitely, without adjustment. Patricia understood this clearly. She was a woman of considerable practical intelligence, and she had been watching the finances of the family with an attention that increased as the indications became more visible. The house required decisions that Edwina had not made, either because the decisions were genuinely difficult or because making them would have required a sustained engagement with the question of the future that her pace of life had never allowed. Lewis was still alive. He was 60 years old in 1960, in good health, and occupying senior positions in the defense establishment with the energy of a man who had no intention of reducing his activity. He was also living at Broadlands, which complicated the question of what to do with it. The house was his home. It was also Patricia's inheritance. The arrangement was manageable, but not indefinitely so, and it required everyone involved to maintain a careful balance between the practical requirements of the situation and the emotional ones, which is to say, between what needed to happen financially and what Louis was prepared to accept. The solution eventually arrived at was the one that large English houses with insufficient private income and sufficient historical significance increasingly arrived at in the post-war decades. Opening to the public. Broadlands began admitting visitors in the 1970s, offering tours of the staterooms, the grounds, and the material evidence of a family whose connections to British history were genuine and extensive. The house became, in the vocabulary of the heritage industry, an attraction. People paid to walk through the rooms where Edwina had grown up, where the Mountbattens had entertained, where photographs of royalty hung alongside the portraits of earlier owners. The decision was practical, and it worked, in the limited sense that it provided a revenue stream that partially offset the costs of maintaining a house that could not be maintained on private income alone. It also produced a particular transformation in the nature of the place. A house that opens its rooms to the paying public is no longer organized around the people who live in it. It is organized around the story it tells about itself, the curated version of its own history that the tour guides describe and that the visitors receive. Broadlands became, in its public form, a monument to the Mountbatten name. The gap between the monument and what the house had actually contained was not visible to the people on the tours. Mary, in these same years, was living in England in circumstances that did not generate the kind of documentation that Broadlands and its management produced. She had returned from Kenya, settled in reduced circumstances, and was managing the continuing legal and financial complications of her connection to the Delamere estate, with declining energy and declining health. She was in her late 50s and then her 60s during this period, and the combination of the drinking, the financial strain, and the accumulated wear of a life that had not provided many of the things it had appeared to promise was visible to the people who knew her. She and Edwina had spoken in the last years before Edwina's death with the regularity that geographic proximity allows and that mutual busyness reduces. The conversations, by the accounts available, were affectionate but not deep. Two women who had shared a childhood and then diverged into entirely different lives, maintaining the connection without having fully closed the distance that the divergence had created. Mary had watched her sister's life from a considerable remove for most of their adult years. Now she watched its aftermath from a similar distance. Lewis, in the 1960s, continued to move through the world with the confidence of a man who believed his work was not finished. He involved himself in defense policy, in the question of British nuclear deterrence, in the reorganization of the armed services, questions of genuine strategic importance that he engaged with genuine intelligence alongside the self-promotion that had always been part of how he operated. He wrote his memoirs, participated in documentary films about his career, and maintained the public narrative of the Mountbatten name with the same systematic attention he had brought to everything involving his own reputation. The family connection to royalty deepened in these years in ways that Louis managed with practiced care. His nephew Prince Philip had married Princess Elizabeth in 1947. His great-nephew Prince Charles was growing up, and Louis developed a relationship with him of considerable closeness. Advisor, confidant, the older man whose worldliness and connection Charles found compelling. The relationship was genuine. It was also, in the way of all Louis's relationships with people of significance, carefully maintained. Broadlands hosted the royal honeymoon of Charles and Diana in 1981. The house that Cassell had built his fortune to eventually fund, that Edwina had inherited at 19 and spent 39 years moving away from, was by then a heritage site with a gift shop and a car park. The newlyweds arrived by car to a house prepared for visitors. They stayed for several days. The photographs were published. The house performed its function. Louis was not alive to see it. He had been killed 2 years earlier. On the morning of August 27, 1979, Louis Mountbatten boarded his boat, the Chateau Fee, in the harbor at Mullaghmore on the northwest coast of Ireland. He had been staying at Classybon Castle, the family's summer residence in County Sligo, as he had done for many years. The area was known to his security detail as a location of potential risk. The Irish Republican Army had been active in the region, and warnings had been communicated through official channels that his presence there made him a target. The warnings were not acted on with the urgency that subsequent inquiries suggested they deserved. Louis boarded the boat. Members of his family, including his 14-year-old grandson Nicholas Knatchbull and a 15-year-old local boy named Paul Maxwell, were with him. The IRA had attached a bomb to the hull of the Chateau Fee the previous night. It detonated shortly after the boat left the harbor. Louis was killed instantly. Nicholas Knatchbull and Paul Maxwell were also killed. Louis's daughter Patricia, who was on the boat, survived with serious injuries. Her husband John Brabourne's mother, the Dowager Lady Brabourne, died the following day from her wounds. Louis was 79 years old. He had lived long enough to see India independent, the British Empire substantially dissolved. The naval career he had organized his life around concluded at its highest position, and the family name attached to the kind of historical permanence, Broadlands, the royal connections, the documentaries and memoirs, that he had worked toward with consistent purpose. He had not lived to see what the name would look like from the outside, several decades further along. The death was a national event. The state funeral produced the ceremonial scale that Louis would have recognized as appropriate to his position. The coverage was extensive. Margaret Thatcher attended. Prince Charles, who had been close to Louis in the way of a son who had found in an older man what his own father did not provide, gave a public address that described his grief without restraint. The loss was genuine, and the mourning was genuine, and the public dimension of both was, as with everything involving Louis, considerable. Patricia survived. She had been on the boat. She had lost her son Nicholas in the explosion and had watched it happen. She continued. She managed the family's affairs, protected the archives, participated in the official commemorations, and became, in the decades that followed, the keeper of a history that required keeping. She was meticulous and controlled and effective, and the grief she carried was not something she expressed in public forms that the record has preserved. Mary died in 1977, 2 years before Louis. She was 71. The circumstances of her later years, the reduced finances, the health complications, the legal residue of the Delamere inheritance disputes, had left her by the end in a position that bore little resemblance to the world she had grown up in. Her death was noted in the newspapers with the brevity that attaches to people who are primarily known through their connection to someone more documented than themselves. She was described as the sister of the late Countess Mountbatten of Burma. The description was accurate and complete. The legal and financial questions surrounding the Delamere estate had not been fully resolved at the time of her death. They continued afterward in the way of such questions, requiring the attention of lawyers and executors and family members who had not chosen to be involved in them. The fortune that Cassell had accumulated with such precision had, in Mary's line, dispersed through colonial land, inheritance disputes, and the accumulated costs of a life lived in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. There was not nothing left, but there was considerably less than there had been, and what remained was tied up in forms that were difficult to access and disputed in their ownership. Nehru had died in May 1964, 4 years after Edwina. He had been Prime Minister of India continuously from independence until his death. 17 years of governance that transformed and sometimes damaged a country of extraordinary complexity. He died in office, still working, which was the only way his life had ever been organized. The letters from Edwina were in his study. His daughter Indira became prime minister 2 years later, managing the country her father had shaped with a different temperament and different methods. And the relationship between her parents' political project and the woman who had stood in Government House in August 1947 receded further into the historical record. The letters Nehru had kept were eventually made available to researchers partially. The full correspondence has not been published. The portions that have been released are enough to establish the nature of what passed between them, the intellectual engagement, the emotional honesty, the quality of attention each brought to what the other wrote, but not enough to settle every question about what the relationship was, precisely in its most private dimensions. This is perhaps appropriate. Some things were meant to remain between the people involved. Broadlands was donated to a charitable trust in 1991. The house continued to operate as a heritage attraction, hosting tours and events and the occasional royal visit, maintaining the outward form of a significant English country house, while the family that had given it its most documented chapter moved further into the past. The gift shop sold books about the Mountbattens. The staterooms were maintained in the condition that visitors expected. Pamela Mountbatten, the younger daughter, published her memoirs in 2012. The book described her childhood with the textured honesty of someone who had spent decades deciding how much to say, and had finally decided to say most of it. It was reviewed widely and read with the interest that attaches to accounts of extraordinary privilege described from the inside. She described her mother with love and with clarity, the warmth, the absence, the impossible pace, the quality of attention that appeared suddenly and then disappeared again. She described what it had been like to be the child of someone whose gifts were primarily directed outward. The book sold well. People found it moving. Pamela attended the events organized around its publication and answered questions about her mother and father and the world they had inhabited with the equanimity of someone who has made her peace with a history that does not simplify. The sea off the Solent where Edwina was buried is indistinguishable from the rest of the Solent. There is no marker. The water moves. Edwina Mountbatten left behind organizations that continued working after her death, letters that a man kept until his own death, daughters who grew up and made their lives, and a house that now charges admission. These are the measurable residues. They do not add up to a conclusion. The fortune that made everything possible, Castle's fortune, built across 40 years of financial precision by a man who was never entirely accepted by the world he had bought his way into, funded 3 generations of extraordinary expenditure before dispersing into legal disputes, colonial land, and the running costs of a heritage attraction in Hampshire. The accumulation and the dissipation took approximately the same amount of time. Mary's name appears in footnotes. Her life, which lasted 71 years and included a childhood in the same houses as her sister, a marriage on another continent, and a final decade of reduced circumstances in England, has not generated the documentation required to be fully reconstructed. What can be said is that the conditions she was born into promised more than they delivered, and that the gap between the promise and the delivery was not something she had the resources to bridge. Edwina moved through the world at a pace that the world found impressive, and that her body eventually could not sustain. Whether the pace was chosen or compelled, whether it was the expression of a genuine appetite for work or the management of something that stillness would have made unavoidable, is not a question the record answers. Probably both things were true simultaneously. They usually are. The Indian Navy frigate that stood offshore at her burial was sent on the personal instruction of a man who would be dead 4 years later, who had kept her letters in his study, and whose own country was still in the early years of the independence that both of them had, in their different ways, been present for. What the letters said, the full letters, the ones not yet published, remains unknown outside the small number of people who have read them. Nehru kept them bound and organized. That much is documented.